Welcome back, deep divers. We've covered some pretty wild stories on this show, but today's is, well, let's just say it's a sticky situation.
Sticky is right, and surprisingly sweet.
Exactly. The great Canadian maple syrup heist, and I gotta say, the name alone just grabs you.
Oh, absolutely. It's like something out of a Coen Brothers film.
Yeah.
You just can't make this stuff up.
No kidding. So we're going to dive deep into this story using contemporary news articles, court documents, interviews, and even a couple of documentaries and TV shows inspired by the whole thing.
Right. And our mission, as always, is to separate fact from fiction, unpack the motivations, and explore the wider implications of this rather unique crime.
Because let's face it, stealing almost 3,000 tons of maple syrup, that's not your everyday five-finger discount.
Definitely not. We're talking millions and millions of Canadian dollars worth of syrup just gone poof. It's actually the most valuable heist in Canadian history if you adjust for inflation.
Wow. Now that's a lot of pancakes you could drench. But seriously, to pull off something this big, you'd need a pretty sophisticated operation. Right.
Absolutely. And this is where the story gets even more interesting. The source of all this stolen syrup was the Federation of Quebec Maple Syrup Producers, or FPAQ, now known as the PPAQ. They essentially control the global maple syrup market.
Wait a minute. A single organization controls most of the world's maple syrup. I mean, I knew Canada was like maple syrup central, but that's a lot of power.
It is. They produce something like 3/4 of the world's pure maple syrup. So yeah, they have a huge influence on the market.
Okay, so before we get into the heist itself, can you explain why this FPAQ is so powerful? Like, how do they end up controlling so much syrup?
It all started back in the late 1950s. Basically, Quebec's maple syrup producers got together and decided to create a joint marketing plan. Strength in numbers and all that. This eventually morphed into a more formal agreement in 1966.
So like a co-op or something?
Sort of, but it eventually became much more than that. By the early 2000s, the FPAQ had become what's known as a legal cartel, meaning they have the legal right to control the supply and price of maple syrup in Quebec.
A cartel.
Wow.
So every single drop of syrup produced in Quebec has to go through them.
Exactly. They set production quotas for each producer. They set the prices, the whole 9 yards. It's all designed to stabilize the market and ensure fair prices for producers.
Sounds kind of communist to me.
Well, it's a system that's been in place for a long time, and it's not without its critics. Some producers have argued that the FPAQ's strict control stifles competition and innovation.
Okay. But it's all legal, right?
Absolutely. And to enforce those controls, the FPAQ has the power to impose hefty fines for any violations. We're talking hundreds of thousands of dollars for exceeding quotas or trying to sell syrup outside the system.
Wow. So you can imagine how that might lead to some resentment, right?
Yeah.
Especially if you're a producer who feels like you're being held back.
Definitely. And there have been protests and legal challenges over the years. But the FPAQ has always maintained that their system is necessary to protect the industry as a whole.
Interesting. So we've got this valuable commodity, a powerful organization controlling it, and potential for some underlying tension. Sounds like the perfect recipe for a heist, right?
It does, doesn't it?
Yeah.
And that brings us to 2011. It was a bumper year for maple syrup production, and the FPAQ had more syrup than they could handle.
So they're swimming in syrup. What did they do?
They needed more storage space, so they leased a temporary warehouse in a small town called Saint Louis de Blanford.
Okay, but this is a massive stockpile of valuable syrup we're talking about. Surely they had top-notch security, right?
Well, that's where things get a little bit unbelievable. The security at this warehouse was shockingly lax. No cameras, no alarm systems. Basically, it was an open invitation for anyone with sticky fingers.
Seriously, no security on a warehouse full of millions of dollars worth of syrup. I'm starting to see how this heist happened.
It does make you wonder, doesn't it? And remember, this was peak maple syrup season. People were busy harvesting and processing, maybe not paying as close attention to inventory as they normally would.
Okay, so walk us through the heist itself. How did they actually pull it off?
It was a surprisingly long con. Over several months, starting in late 2011 and continuing into 2012, the thieves used trucks to gradually move barrels of syrup out of the warehouse.
Just driving up and loading them up, that seems awfully brazen.
Initially, they were more subtle. They'd siphon the syrup out of the barrels, replace it with water, and then return the barrels to the warehouse.
Clever, but also a lot of work. How many barrels are we talking about here?
Thousands. And each barrel weighs over 600 pounds when full. So it was a massive undertaking.
And they did all this without anyone noticing.
For a while, yes. But as the months went on, they got bolder. They started just draining the syrup straight from the barrels and not even bothering to replace it with water.
Wow. So they're siphoning off millions of dollars worth of syrup, and they've got to hide it somewhere, right? What did they do with it all?
They had a network set up. They moved the stolen syrup to a remote sugar shack, and then from there they transported it to different locations. Some went south to Vermont, some went east to New Brunswick.
Across state lines and international borders, this is getting more and more complex. What were they doing with it in those places?
They were selling it, of course, but not in bulk. They broke it down into smaller batches and sold it to various buyers, including some legitimate maple syrup distributors who were probably completely unaware of its origins.
Wow. So they were essentially laundering the stolen syrup back into the legal market. That's pretty sophisticated.
It is. And for a while they got away with it. But eventually, of course, the jig was up.
How did they finally get caught? Did someone tip off the authorities?
It was actually a routine inventory check in July 2012 that exposed the whole scheme. An inspector was checking the barrels like he always did, tapping them to see how full they were.
Makes sense. But those barrels are heavy, right?
Oh, yeah, over 600 pounds when they're full of syrup. But when the inspector got to the top of one stack, he tapped a barrel, and it felt really light and unstable.
Uh-oh. Sounds like a bad sign.
It was. He looked inside, and the barrel was completely empty. As he checked more barrels, he found more and more that were either empty or filled with water.
I can only imagine the panic that set in.
It was a huge shock. The scale of the theft was mind-blowing. The FPAQ estimated that about 10% of their entire reserve was gone.
So the investigation began. Where did it lead them?
The trail led to a maple syrup exporter in New Brunswick, and eventually to a network of individuals who were involved in the heist.
Okay, so who are the main players in this sticky saga?
The suspected ringleader was a guy named Richard Vallières. He was sentenced to 8 years in prison and fined $9.4 million.
$9.4 million. That's a hefty fine.
It is. There were some legal challenges and appeals, but the Supreme Court of Canada ultimately upheld the original fine.
Wow. Justice was served. Who else was involved?
Richard's father, Raymond Vallières, was also convicted of possessing the stolen syrup. He got a jail sentence and probation. Then there's Etienne St. Pierre. He was the New Brunswick reseller who helped move the syrup into the legal market. He also got jail time, probation, and a big fine.
So a real family affair, huh? Anyone else?
Oh, yeah. There was Avec Caron. His spouse owned the warehouse where the syrup was stored.
Uh-huh. The inside man.
Exactly. He served time and paid a fine as well.
What about the people who actually transported all that syrup? Any of them get caught?
One of the truckers, Sebastian Jutras, was convicted and served 8 months in prison. His testimony during the trial was pretty interesting.
Oh, what did he say?
He talked about collecting large sums of cash on behalf of Richard Vallières, and he quoted Vallières as saying, "Stealing from thieves is not stealing."
Whoa, that's a pretty bold statement. It sounds like Vallières saw the FPAQ as the real criminals.
It does, doesn't it? That quote really gives you a glimpse into his mindset. It's those little details that make these stories so fascinating.
Absolutely. Speaking of fascinating, this whole maple syrup heist saga has actually inspired some TV shows and documentaries, right?
It has. There's an episode of the Netflix documentary series Dirty Money that covers the case. And then there's the Amazon Prime Video dark comedy series, The Sticky.
I've heard of The Sticky. Is it a straight retelling of the events?
Not exactly. It's loosely based on the real heist, but it takes a lot of creative liberties.
Like what?
Well, for one thing, there's a dead body found in a barrel of syrup in the show.
Okay, that's definitely not in the real story.
Right. And the main motivation for the theft in the show is revenge. A farmer is angry about losing his land or something like that. It's more about personal grudges than just stealing syrup for profit.
So more drama, more intrigue.
Exactly. The show also portrays the leadership of the syrup management organization as corrupt, which wasn't a factor in the real case.
So it's a fictionalized version inspired by the real events, but not a documentary.
Right. The screenwriter even said that he got the idea for the show from a conversation at a family Christmas party. It's amazing how these real-life stories can spark such creative fictional narratives.
It really is. So let's step back for a minute and look at the big picture. What are some of the key takeaways from this whole maple syrup heist?
Well, first of all, it shows that even the most seemingly mundane commodities can become targets for sophisticated criminal enterprises.
I mean, maple syrup. Who would have thought?
Right. But when you consider the value of that much syrup, it starts to make sense, especially back in 2012 when commodity prices were high.
So basically they saw an opportunity and they exploited it.
Exactly. And the lack of security at that warehouse was a huge factor.
No kidding. But beyond the actual heist, the story also raises questions about the role of organizations like the FPAQ.
Absolutely. Their tight control over the market might have contributed to the resentment that fueled the heist.
It's like that old saying, absolute power corrupts, absolutely.
Right. And even though their intentions might have been good, their methods might have inadvertently created an environment where something like this could happen.
It's a complex issue for sure, and it makes you wonder what measures are in place now to prevent another sweet crime spree.
That's a great question for our listeners to ponder. What kind of security upgrades do you think the FPAQ has implemented since the heist? And what lessons can other industries learn from this?
Yeah. What other seemingly ordinary things might be surprisingly vulnerable to theft? It's something to think about.
Definitely. And on that note, we'll leave you to ponder the strange and sticky world of maple syrup crime.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the great Canadian maple syrup heist.
Until next time, stay sweet and be careful out there,
You never know what might be lurking in the shadows.
especially if it involves maple syrup.